So, Mahdis, we want to have a bit of a chat about cultural appropriation versus, what did I write to you this morning? I wrote it out and I should read
Cultural
it.
appreciation.
Versus cultural appreciation versus emulation versus all sorts of other things that we are talking about in society today. Now, I have to say, I've had this conversation before, and I started it actually 12 months ago on St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day being my day. People who don't know, can't tell, I'm half Irish. My mother's grandparents were both straight out of Belfast, which means she was 100% Irish once removed, which means I am half Irish twice removed. That's my genealogy. So, and my mum was Irish. I mean, she was born in New Zealand, but it was you went back to Ireland and everything made sense and fitted in. So it's a part of who I am and what I am. I had this realization 12 months ago, driving through North Dunedin, funnily enough, and the students, and seeing a whole bunch of students dressed in green, getting shit face on St. Patrick's Day, celebrating, quote unquote, St. Patrick's Day. And I just had the thought, I'm like, if it was a different patron saint's day and these students were dressed in different garb, I wonder how that would be accepted within society. And it wasn't me kind of going, don't you do that with my culture. It was me just kind of pondering out loud, what if they were dressed in a different religious day's garb, getting shit faced and drinking to celebrate it? How would that be accepted versus how do we all kind of love going out for a Guinness on St. Patrick's Day? And that's where kind of the conversation started for me. And we were going to talk about this yesterday, but we actually ran out of time. And Mahdis, because you were coming on today, and as I've described you before, you sort of have a PhD in racism, and you're going to be the perfect person to talk to this about as well. So let me set this up by saying, purely by chance, South Park yesterday, the episode that came out yesterday, brand spanking new, talked exactly about this. I'll play a little clip here, and you'll see about them South Park are geniuses. They make fun of stuff which is actually, it's a double entendre, points back 3 levels. What they're not actually talking about is what's he talking. So just to set it up, this is not what I'm talking about. This is what South Park did yesterday.
And a fine St. Patrick's Day to all of you. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a farm across the street selling weed also. And the owner is actually 10% Irish.
So obviously you're upset that you don't seem to have any customers.
What I'm upset about is a wee little thing called cultural appropriation. Ever heard of it? That's why we can't wear sombreros on Cinco de Mayo. Why we can't dress like Indians on Halloween.
What's your point?
I'm looking at my point, you racist son of a bitch.
They go on. As South Park does, they are offensive and make their points, but that's what it is. So, I don't know how to really start this, to be honest with you, Mahdis. I think I've set up the idea of what is cultural appropriation. I have examples up the wazoo of, Asian boba tea stores in New York being accused of cultural appropriation because they're selling black tea. Speaking of the Irish thing, I've got examples of an amazing Irish dancer. I'll put that on, bring it back up. Who is African American. And she's been accused of cultural appropriation because she's not Irish. And she's amazing. She's like one of the best in her field, in her country, sort of thing. And what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to understand and learn, because I think we're in a transition in society right now where we're not rewriting rules, but we're kind of fleshing them out and trying to figure out what all these sorts of things are and how they relate to our daily lives. So how about I just shut up and sit back and give the floor to you to see what you want to say.
Yes, I'm not. So my examples might not be so much focused on St. Patrick's Day, but I'll start off with, I think there's a difference between talking about a cultural appropriation as a critique of behaviors that kind of reinforce already existing power structures. So things that might produce a demonization of cultures, or create a caricature of cultures, or appropriate ideas for the benefit of others, right? So I think there's always the critique is one thing. And then there's the other thing is, how does that critique get picked up in the everyday and people use it? Those overlap, but they aren't identical. So I think, yes, there might be some people who might look at an I don't know if this person was African American or just the black dancer as doing cultural appropriation. What we can't conflate that one critique with that one example is the essence of what people are trying to do with cultural appropriation. So usually cultural appropriation talks about how dominant groups, dominant cultural practices pick up symbols, practices, ideas of minority groups that decontextualize them, essentialize these groups, and also create benefit for the ones who are using them. So one really, really common example of that is the fashion industry, how haute couture houses, these mega brands, will steal patterns from indigenous women in, let's say, Central America, put them on the runway, make billions of dollars without accrediting where that pattern has come from, while these communities are, living in poverty and not getting recognized that those same patterns or embroidery has actual cultural significance to people. Right. So the critique is you're completely emptying this cultural practice, this embroidery or whatever, this pattern design, whatever it is that we're looking at, of its original meaning. And then the other critique is you're actually benefiting from something that isn't yours. So I think that's very different from, somebody went to, let's say, Guatemala and picked up a shirt with embroidery that they bought from a local, artist. And then that same shirt travels to New York and is worn by somebody. So I think that is one of the ways in which we need to understand where cultural appropriation is coming from. It's not nobody should ever wear anything that belongs to another group. It's about how is that picked up? Another example would be, I think we can see that in the wellness sector as well, how yoga over time has been completely detached from where it's originally come from and to the benefit of a completely different demographic sector, right? Like the people who make money are not necessarily the people where the practices come from. And it's left the people outside, right? So people who are obsessed with turmeric tea love the tea, but they don't love, the sub-Indian, like the Indian subcontinent where that tea may come from. So I think it's kind of highlighting, you can say that you love and appreciate something if you actually hate its people that it's attached to, or you only love it if it creates benefit for you. Now with St. Patrick's Day, I think it is a little bit, there's a complexity to St. Patrick's Day because it is something that I think started by Irish minority groups, but it is so inherently tied to how St. Patrick's Day developed in the United States, and then how the version of St. Patrick's Day, how it happens in the United States, got globalized, right? So I don't think it is just a diasporic Irish thing. It is very much a diasporic Irish practice in the United States, and then how it evolved in the United States and then was exported everywhere else. I've got a lot of Irish friends who have the same unease, I think, when they see what that looks like. St. Patrick's Day isn't really a thing in Germany. Like there's some people who go to an Irish pub on that day, but when I was growing up, it wasn't really something visible. So I was quite surprised when I came here how tight people were to it. But again, it kind of creates this really flattened image of what Irishness is. But now we can also talk about how Irish people over time have gone from being a really marginalized group to kind of having made it into being included into the mainstream, which kind of also, I think, shifts the dynamic of how this power imbalance needs to be considered, right? So I think I personally don't really hold on to like percentages and authentic versions of Irish people, because there's people in Ireland who look like me, and who might express their Irishness in very different ways, or people like me who might think that Germanness is about bratwurst and beer and Oktoberfest, and I've never been to the Oktoberfest. Doesn't make me in any way less authentic, So I think that it is a bit more complex, but people who point out cultural appropriation as a systemic issue are pointing out how cultural appropriation sometimes is an extension of a benign way in which we perpetrate racism.
It sounds like one of the things you're saying, and look at me. I'm at school taking notes as you're writing away there. It sounds like, if I can hear what you're saying, like, so for example, you mentioned if it been the cultural appropriation, you use the example of fashion if it benefits the one who are using them, and that I think that's really easy to see if you have, like you say, a fashion line. What about when I don't know what about I don't actually want to get into examples, because it sounds like what you're saying is, if I can say, pure actual technical accurate cultural appropriation is a lot bigger than screaming at the person selling black tea. Maybe even, although it's really weird, Mahdis, and I don't know how much of my kind of racist history I'm going to reveal by saying things like this, but like I'm uncomfortable at the moment using descriptors that other people use accurately. Like the term, when we're referring to someone who's African American in America as black, is the term that is used widely and accurately, and there's no connotations to it. I feel uncomfortable describing someone as black, because I think aren't they more than that? Like I was thinking about something today, and those sorts of starting to use terms where you put people into these descriptors that some then think, oh well, that means because you're racially sort of profiling them or that kind of stuff. And I guess maybe this is a conversation just for me trying to work all this out and work out what it is, because when you talk about benefits the ones who are using them, that says to me straight away, well, the person wearing the Native American headdress, they're just wearing it. That's fine then. But then again, that's the example we get in the media of the worst kind of cultural appropriation. So is it that the media is blowing up stories that aren't necessarily the context of what cultural appropriation is, or is it that it is deeper than just getting a financial benefit from it? There's other things as well.
I mean, it is that is also an example of cultural appropriation. So the person selling the headdress and the person picking up the headdress and wearing it as costume are both, like, I think they're part of the same problem, right? I think that there's I think sometimes in Western countries we think everything is up for grabs and everything can be turned into a commodity, and I think we should have conversations over, is everything is up for grabs? Is anything taboo? So I don't think that people who want to talk about cultural appropriation are driven about, oh, there are things that can be said and there are things that can never be said. There are things that can be worn and there's things that can't ever be worn. I think people want to highlight how sometimes really benign actions are reproductions of systematic inequality. Like the fact that we think that something that is sacred to First Nations people can be costume that we wear to a festival.
Yeah.
Right? Or that these practices are somehow in the past because the people who were attached to them are all dead and exterminated. So these actions on an individual level help to maintain these myths about people as inferior, people as, gimmicks to and it also kind of reproduces that we as, and I say we as like a, like a collective we, how we maintain people in a position of being dominated because we are the ones who dictate the narrative. So one way power works is that those who have it get to define what is and isn't a problem, what isn't acceptable. And the moment people resist that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to shift the power. Okay, so I do think that, yes, people who are making money robbing and claiming things that isn't theirs is the problem, but also what narratives are reproduced in our actions. And again, like as systemic inequality is systemic, we can internalize it, it can show up interpersonally, it can show up in our groups, but it also shows up institutionally. So for me, when we say, hey, maybe don't dress up as an ethnic group for Halloween, that is a critique of that person, that is a critique of the people selling these costumes, but it's also an invitation to a broader conversation. Why do we think certain people are gimmicks for us to use? Right? And why can't we hear them?
Can I just jump in? Because I know you've said it's kind of contextualized based around the sort of American version of St. Patrick's Day, but that does bring me straight back to that idea of people dressing up as Irish sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't feel as sensitive because it's not necessarily the sacred garb, right? I get that, but it's still, it still has an element of that dressing up and to identify from that nation. But what I wanted to ask you, and this is maybe a overly blunt question, is how much of this is just about whiteness versus non-whiteness? Because I'm a very let me explain. I'm a very good mimic, right? I'm good at doing accents. I can do dozens of accents. I do it quite well. I've done it for a long time. Me doing an accent of a culture like Scottish or American, or let's say a predominant Caucasian culture, no one would have a problem with that. Me doing an accent of an Asian or a Indian or a predominantly non-Caucasian culture, people are like, oh yeah, it's I don't know, I'm not sure about that. Now I'm not part of that American culture, or I'm not part of that Scottish culture or that South African culture, but they are predominantly Caucasian and I'm Caucasian. Equally, I'm not part of the Indian culture or the or Asian Japanese culture or whatever. So I don't know if that's a terrible question to ask.
I think it's okay. So if you're using something and you make an accent to piss at power, I think it's okay. If you're making that accent to kick down to people who are disempowered, that's being a bully. So I think that's a difference between bullying and satire. Like satire pisses at power, and bullying is when you kick down at people who have less power than you. And I think that's how I would make that differentiation.
Right.
I imitate the accent of my parents all the time. But I think if we're doing it in a way that demeans, or if we're doing it in a way that uplifts, I think there's a difference. People can do a really good accent. I would love to be able to do a good Scottish accent. I do think, so I think, has it something to do with whiteness? I use the word whiteness because I'll send you a different link. Like Caucasian has also like a very interesting history as a term.
Whiteness is fine.
Yeah, it has. I think it has something to do with that, because we think this is a group that has kind of been included into whiteness. I think that's really important to say, that the Irish in particular have been a group that have kind of over time been included in that collective. I do think people point that out about St. Patrick's Day as well, that it is mocking, and it reduces Irish people to binge drinking. So I do think that a lot of those
drinking Irishmen
too. I think that it's important for us to do, like, to have those conversations openly. I just don't like when some niche Twitter fight becomes the representation of what the critique is. And sometimes we think what happens on Twitter is what's actually happening in real life, just because it seems so loud.
Yeah.
So I think, is the consequence the same for someone who's yelled at by even 500, 5,000, 500,000 people on Twitter, than if there's actual real life consequences? So I think sometimes the screaming on social media is taken as evidence for people are not allowed to express themselves, which I think isn't quite accurate. I always want to keep the conversation about cultural appropriation tied to what it should be tied to: conversations about colonization, conversations around racism and racist practice. So I think that's a really good one. And I think within that, there's space to talk about the representation of St. Patrick's Day, that so many people so happily participate in, So I find it quite strange how, I guess, a big commercial day, like, it's commercially driven that way, because people sell all sorts of merchandise and give people an excuse to be drunk during the day. So I think maybe the conversation around commodification is an important one to have, like the critique of the way things get commodified.
This conversation, I could probably have you for the next 2 hours. We've done 2 podcasts before, and it's sort of the conversations we have had and those big, long conversations. But I want to ask one more question based on the back of this. And I want to bring George in as well, because I can see him in the background nodding away. And so I'm sure he's got some stuff to add. But the last thing is, we're talking about appropriation, emulation, appreciation culturally. Culturalness, I guess race, is a protected class. What about this flowing on into other protected classes? And we're having conversations at the moment, for example, and not to belabor the point, but Lin-Manuel Miranda set up In the Heights movie and got criticized for not using the correct Latinos in that representation. So, but that's a make-believe movie, but then it's okay for a lesbian woman to play a straight woman, which you could argue is a protected class as well, going across from one to the other. Or a young person playing an older person. Why aren't they saying, well, if you're going to play an older person in a movie, you must have an older person to play that movie? And I don't know whether it's same or similar, but I feel like at the moment, and this is me, maybe I'm wrong, but in society we're having these conversations and there's a lot of things to figure out to make it work in society, because if it's not okay in one aspect of a protected class, then one could argue that what if they do exactly the same in a different protected class and it's fine? Or are there different levels of acceptance for different protected classes, and is that just how it is?
So I always refrain from doing using relativism, because otherwise we don't talk about where the problem is. So for me, if we're talking about an underserved, under-resourced, underrepresented, exploited category that seeks to access representation, resources, and potentially a shift in the power, then that's very different than people who have historically enjoyed access, resources, and power doing the same, right? So if we say, oh, here's a straight actress playing a trans character, we're talking about a category of people who have very easily have access to all sorts of roles, and then we're talking about a subject position that historically hasn't had that same representation, access, and power. So I think that's really what it comes to. It's not, oh, Mahdis can only talk about issues that impact German Iranians of a particular class background who were born in the 1980s, right? It's not about that. And I think we need to be really, really careful to not make it that. And I'm not saying that is only done by the people who don't like these conversations. That's sometimes also done by the people who are kind of thinking that they're fighting for these conversations. I think the struggle is good. That's how social change happens. Social change happens also with backlash and tension, and pointing out that something is good, but it could have been done better is not inherently a rejection. And it just shows that, we're works in progress, and it's okay to be held accountable. Maybe we can have a conversation over what are the best ways to create systems of accountability.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's just a personal note, I think calling out has some value. I do it occasionally for some things, but I'm really working on myself to create a culture of calling people in. Not with Nazis. No desire to call in a Nazi. I have to say, there are limits to who you call in. But I think that's a different conversation. Are we having a conversation about, oh, I don't like your accountability mechanism? Or are we having a conversation, oh, I don't like you telling me that I was racist? Because that's completely different. So I think sometimes those get muddled. And also we don't have enough space to actually sit with our discomfort and just talk safely. Like, I love my class for that. I'm like, in my class, no stupid questions, no, everything is allowed. Like, literally everything is allowed. And as society, we think, oh, I'll use my platform with 5 million followers. Oh, sorry, I was just practicing. It's like, fuck, man, like, no. Sorry, my mother was like, am I supposed to curse or not? I think time and place, find your safe people who can help you. But accountability also requires radical humility, I think.